program, defining project completion. And the next step is to enter progress and record the effect. So at the time now bar, in the centre of the slide, we can see that the first activity has been completed on time. The second activity, there's been a little bit of a delay. That might be the responsibility of the contractor who just hasn't progressed his works as he originally planned. And we can see when we schedule out the remaining works that it's caused a delay to project completion. But at time now, we are going to now impact the effect of a delay. And when we do that, and we reschedule the outstanding works, we can see that the completion date has moved out even further. But what we've done now is, in looking at this overall period of delay, we've actually managed to find that this little bit of delay was caused by the contractor's slow progress, and this bit of the delay is caused by the delaying event. So we're really now getting to grips with what we've to explaining this overall delay. All too often I get to the end of I look at projects and get to the end, and people just see this overall delay. And it's a matter of disentangling the delays as and when they occur to explain the build-up of this overall delay.
Sorry, Ewen, the time now is pre-mitigation, or you're allowed to do post-mitigation on the programme?
You are allowed to do post-mitigation on the programme. In an ideal world, to work out the effect of a delay on completion, you update the programme to immediately before the delay occurred, and then impact the delay to see what the effect is immediately thereafter. You should record everything at that point and see what the delay was, record it, and then if you want to mitigate, you can mitigate and show the other side what you've then done. You might have even used additional resources or resequenced your program. You can then do that afterwards and show that as a separate step, because that's it's a very good question, because I often find that planners update their program and they start mitigating things immediately, and you lose the measurement of the effect of what would have been the situation but for their mitigation. So that's a very key point. If you do mitigate, make sure you've measured the delay first. So, in summary, it is actually a prospective method of delay analysis where you can do it throughout the currency of your project, as the NEC former contract requires. But you can actually do it retrospectively. That is, you can wait to the end of the project and put yourselves back in the shoes of when perhaps a project manager issued an instruction to see what the effect was at that point back in time. It demonstrates cause and effect. I was showing you the effects of the delaying events and explaining how it contributed to the part of the overall delay. It takes account of progress, resource logic, so it is reliable in dispute resolution. It's actually, I referred earlier to the delay and disruption protocol from the Society of Construction Law. It's their preferred method. But just let me tell you about a couple of disadvantages of this method. One, it's complicated. It seems very simple, as I've shown you on a 3-bar program, but we all know out there in the field programs have thousands of activities, so it can get very complicated to follow the delays arising throughout your project. And it can be also difficult to communicate. I've referred to the case of Skanska v. Egger, where one of the experts used this method of delay analysis and ended up producing, I believe, a couple of hundred charts or so. And the judge found it extremely difficult to follow and preferred the simple, factual story and analysis of the other side's expert. Okay. So what do we need for a a successful delay analysis. What project controls do we need? What data records do we need to keep? And I'll start with looking at programs. The overriding principle here is to allow a comparison of what would have happened with what actually happened. And this is quite an interesting point for me, because we all know what happened, we can see what's happened out there, but we're actually going to be comparing that with a hypothetical situation that never happened. The consequence being, it's a fertile ground for areas of dispute, because you just never know what would have happened but for what actually did happen. But the idea behind forensic delay analysis is that we're always trying to measure change. At the higher level, I'll come on to the details required in programs in a moment, but at the higher level, your programs need to meet your contract requirements. The contract requirements, you need to study the program clauses and the extension of time clauses within your contracts. They're not all the same. If you assume they're the same throughout your contracts, you may result in a loss of entitlement. JCT building contracts are fairly lax. They just require you to have a master program at the start and to update that when the completion date changes. But that contrasts with the NEC form of contract, which is very prescriptive on its time clauses. Its core clause 3, as I said earlier, requires you to look at time, risk allowances, flow to equipment provisions, etc. Programs also need to be a workable management tool. Now, all you top quality project controls people out there probably do have workable management tools. But I often come across a situation when I'm sort of helping companies with distressed projects with cost overruns and time overruns, where the program starts off with a detailed plan program, but as delays occur, the program isn't necessarily updated, and it starts becoming unrealistic and people don't believe what the program's telling them, etc. And eventually it just gets ignored. Your program should also be current. My experience really is that on large projects, multi-million-pound projects, programs generally are only about valid for about 4 weeks before they start coming out of date, as some activities progress ahead of schedule, some fall behind, there are variations, instructions, delays, etc. So you need to update your program to make it current, at least I would suggest, as a rule of thumb, every 4 weeks. They need to be shared. In the dispute arena, you'll be surprised, but you can walk into court and you won't even agree the colour of your socks. So if you've shared the data at the time, it's a record, it's a contemporaneous record that's persuasive, that shows the actual position at the time. And finally, it's the program belongs to the contractor. Normally, the only contractual obligations on the contractor with respect to time are to start and to finish by a certain date, or you have a duration for your works. How the contractor wishes to carry out his works between those two dates is up to him. So it is the contractor's program. So what sort of things would I expect to see in programs? We'll start off with some of the most obvious ones. You're obviously going to expect to see all the activities in the work packages that you've got, and I'd expect them all to be logic linked, and I'd expect them to be able to define a critical path. You're going to need the start and finish dates for every activity, and I'd perhaps like to know the earliest start dates and the latest finish dates to see what can be achieved with the program should we need to make provision for anything that isn't planned. I'd like to see access dates for each phase or section. It's important to recognise that some contracts have sectional completion dates over and above the overall completion date. I worked on a particular project that had, a couple of years ago, that had a dozen sectional completion dates, and they weren't actually shown on the programme. And really the contractor had lost sight of what was affecting what on the programme and which sections were causing delay. He was only looking at the overall completion date. Holiday periods, and should add holiday periods. I'll add calendars to that as well. I worked on a project last year where the award of the contract was 5 weeks late, and it caused a 9-month delay. And you might think, well, how on earth can that be? A 5-week delay equals a 9 months delay. But the significant part of this case was that the 5-week delay pushed the overall contract into the nesting season of a particular species of animal, and the contractor wasn't allowed to carry out his works in that period. But because it was shown on the programme, it was easier to explain. Design. Design is an underestimated part of a programme. Too often I'm dealing with contractors and they don't make adequate provision in their programmes for how the design is carried out. Design programmes, designers are getting better. They do produce programmes now, and these need to be integrated into the contractor's programmes. And in a similar way to design, perhaps you have to provide samples. And you need to always think about if you have to resubmit design or resubmit samples, and see how they might affect your programme. And finally, on this slide, we have procurement periods and delivery dates. An obvious example might be structural steel work. So you might have typically, I don't know, an 8-week procurement period for some structural steel. You might have a 2-week delay to your information for producing steel drawings, but you need to recognise that there's an 8-week period on top of that which might affect your construction programme. Other parts, dates by which work will be ready for testing by the employer, work contained in defined provisional sums, and I would also recommend actually putting in activities representing the likely work content of undefined provisional sums. You're not actually required, or normally required, by particular forms of contract to show undefined provisional sums, the work content on your programme. But if it is something that is likely to be affecting your programme, well, include it. Commissioning periods, often thought of at the end of a project. Well, our commissioning period is the amount of time we've got left at the end to squeeze in, but that's not necessarily realistic. Think about these things and give them the thought that they deserve. The final three are key points for me. Provisions for float and time risk allowance. Time risk allowance being a form of float. In the NEC form of contract, which is becoming more and more in use now, since about 2005, I think it was, the Office of Government Commerce recommended its use as the preferred public procurement method for all construction projects. So it's a form of contract that's used more and more. It's used on the Olympics. And the NEC form of contract actually provides for float. It provides a project float, which is generally owned by the project. And it's available to whoever gets there first. It can absorb delays by either the employer or the contractor. But crucially in the NEC, there are two other forms of float. Time risk allowance. Time risk allowance is the amount of additional time you require to, or you allow for risk to carry out a particular activity. So if I give an example of excavation activity, 14-day estimate, you might allow an extra day for any risks that occur, and you will show on your programme a 15-day duration. But crucially, under the NEC form of contract, it says the contractor owns that time risk allowance. And if you want to show your time risk allowance on your programme, I'd recommend that you'd show, of that 15-day activity, I would recommend that you put it in the spreadsheet part of your programme to show that time risk allowance of 1 day. And it's not there for the employer to absorb any employer delays. There's also something called terminal float in the NEC form of contract, where if you show a planned completion before the completion date, then that is the terminal float, the period at the end of the project when you say, I'm going to finish my work, say at the end of January, the completion date is not until the end of February. That month of February is float, it's called terminal float, and it belongs to the contractor. Oh, how I wish programs would be resourced and costed. I've heard one or two talks this morning talking about integrating costs, etc. And even the companies out there with the software promoting integrated cost analysis recount stories about, well, maybe the master plan program was costed at the start, but rarely do the costs get updated. But if you did resource and cost your programs, you would have such good control. You would have a real management tool, knowing where to look at what is critical, what's coming close to critical, what sort of costs are going to be incurred. It really is, for me, would just improve companies' efficiencies dramatically. And I also like to build in codes or intelligence into your programs, where you can allocate codes to particular activities if they are in particular sections of your project. You can allocate different cost codes with whether they, I don't know, particularly concrete gangs or earthworks, etc. If you build in these codes, you can start to filter your programs, review them and analyse them in far greater detail. Now, other records. Do you think I've got, by the way, do you think I've got to all the rugby players yet? No? Good. I'm just wondering if you're sort of keeping an eye on the rugby. This is the most significant part of my talk, the rugby. Records generally. Okay, so I've been talking about the programme, but records generally, whatever they might be, so I could be talking about variations here or just delays, schedules, etc. Again, they need to provide or allow a comparison of what would have happened with what actually did happen. Forensic delay analysis is all about measuring change. And there might be some contractual requirements. They need to be expressed by reference to the programme. If you've got a variation, or a project manager's instruction, it's not just number 61. You need to identify what activities on the programme it affects so you can see how it affects your programme. It's particularly helpful to the forensic delay analyst. They should be quantitative. They don't want to be, if you're writing correspondence, you just don't want to say, we've got some delay, we've got some disruption. You need to be putting yourself under closer scrutiny and trying to assess what the actual delay disruption is. It almost goes without saying that they should be accurate. They should be regularly kept. There are many cases on projects where perhaps you have late information from one side and you don't know the actual impact of that late information because you don't know when that information is going to come to you. It might be 2 weeks, it might be 4 weeks, it might be 6, 8. Well, if you keep regular updates, then you can monitor that situation. They should be public or shared. Again, if you share this information, it's contemporaneous information. It is therefore more persuasive in a court at a later date. They should be consistent. If you start with a master program and then 6 months later you have a resequence, change your program, and then maybe 3 months later you change it again, you might find it a lot harder to track the delay that's occurring to your project. So you should always try and keep a consistency in monitoring your records, delays to your program. And when I say consistent, that should also mean it should be month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4. If you have a delay in if you update your program in month 1 and then only again in month 6 and then in month 10, and yet the delays occurred in months 4 and 5, you may have lost sight of where that delay occurred. And it should record the context as well. So at a more detailed level, we're looking at records generally meeting the contract requirements. We need to be specifying start and finish dates. When you update your program, it may be very tempting just to say it's 10% complete, 20% complete. That's fine once an activity is started progress, but you need to show the exact start date and the actual finish date. If you're, for example, if a activity starts and you say it's 10% complete, your program software might shift it to the earliest possible start date, but it didn't actually occur on that date. And when you get in the court situation, you'll be criticised for that. And they'll try and make a story that this program doesn't reflect what the actual situation was at all. So yes, degree of completion of activities. So you need, as I say, 10%, 20%, 30% complete. Ideally, and this is, I'm getting into a bit of a wish list here, I'd like to see labour resources by trade, activity and location. I sometimes, if I'm working on a building project, will see that the M&E works are late, there are 3 extra labourers, but then people miss out crucial bits of information like it was on the 2nd floor or on the 3rd floor or on the 4th floor. With labour goes equipment and key procurement activities. Some of the other